Oh, I thought I was. Yeah. All right. We're live. Boom. Now we're back into edifying and fun conversations. So we are trying to get through, and we're about halfway through the fifth of the eight sections of our Philosophy 101 year one backbone course, where we're cherry picking essays on different topics, eight different subjects, eight different questions of philosophy. We are in the a priori section right now, and today we're going to read the first half of the essay that we're going to be reading on Kant in his Introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason. Immanuel Kant. One, the distinction between pure and empirical knowledge. Right. So we remember everything we're talking about here is about these. Oh, we can even bring them up again. We probably don't have to. But everything we're talking about here is the distinctions between analytic and synthetic, the distinctions between a priori and a posteriori, the notions of innate ideas, the notions of, well, why don't we bring this up as a good, let's see if this is it. Nope, that is not it. Let's bring up the slides. Yeah, okay, cool. So we'll remove this one. All right, so we know what we're talking about. We understand about Plato's idea of recollection. We're talking about rationalism, right? So one of the things to highlight really quickly is again just the simple distinction between empiricists and rationalists. Rationalists believe it is possible to come to some knowledge just through the use of your mind alone, whereas empiricists believe that all knowledge can be traced back to something sensory, something through experience. Okay. Uh, any of these others that we want to look at? No. Well, we've so the analytic synthetic distinction is a different one, and it's related, and there's a lot of overlap, and a lot of the argument is about whether or not all the a priori is just analytic or even just tautological. So the analytic synthetic is analytic means you're just analyzing the words. It means the truth of the statement depends upon the meanings of the words and nothing else. Something like all bachelors are unmarried men might be an analytic statement, or the internal angles of a quadrilateral are the same as the internal angles of a circle. They add up to 360 if we're going to talk in degrees. Something like that might be analytic. It's true or not true based on the use of the words alone. So something could be analytically false or analytically true. Whereas synthetic is simply the distinction that it's not just about the words. It has to be about something else also. Obviously, the words mean something, but the distinction between analytic and synthetic is whether or not you can judge the truth value of a statement based on just the meanings of the words alone. We talked about the fact that people who believe in analytic truths and that they're possible don't necessarily believe that you can know them without experience, in the sense that you might need experience in life in order to know what the meanings of words are, but that it's still analytic if the only scale for judging the truth of the statement depends on the meanings of the words alone. So we've looked at a lot of these different distinctions. We can just get rid of this right now, maybe bring it back later if we need to. Okay, so that's the topic we're discussing. Is there such a thing as knowledge I can have even if I'm just a brain in a vat? Knowledge just through reason. Okay, so the first section is the distinction between pure and empirical knowledge. There can be no doubt that all our knowledge begins with experience. That's his first sentence. We're going to remind ourselves that Socrates and Descartes also said something like that. They've also said that, right? Descartes is remembered as a rationalist, but he has said, well, you can't know things unless you've had some experience of them. So, uh, so, and Socrates said the same thing when he was talking about the forms. He goes, you must have experienced them. That was the basis of his argument for the recollection theory and the reincarnation and all of that. I'm just going to shut my phone off because I am uncharacteristically popular, or my attention must be drawn to things today. Okay, so there can be no doubt that all our knowledge begins with experience. For how should our faculty of knowledge be awakened into action did not objects affecting our senses partly of themselves produce representations, partly arouse the activity of our understanding to compare these representations, and by combining or separating them, work up the raw material of the sensible impressions into that knowledge of objects which is entitled experience. In the order of time, therefore, we have no knowledge antecedent to experience, and with experience, all our knowledge begins. But though all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not follow that it all arises out of experience. For it may well be that even our empirical knowledge is made up of what we receive through impressions and of what our own faculty of knowledge, sensible impressions serving merely as the occasion, supplies from itself. Now, this is worth pausing on for Kant. So even our empirical knowledge might rely, partially at least, on something our mind is doing to make it possible for us to have that experience, that sensory experience. There's something out there, and it's in part, as he said earlier, he used the word partly responsible for the perceptions I have of things. And then those perceptions, I can use other mental faculties to make sense of them and to derive and to work out the knowledge of the thing. But even the sense input itself is partly made up of the things that partly, he says, partly induce them. Let's see where he uses that word here. Partly arouse. Partly arouse. Hold on a second. That's new, right? How should our faculty of knowledge be awakened into action did not objects affecting our senses, partly of themselves, produce representations? So he's saying even the experience itself, there might be another part involved here. Okay. For it may well be that our empirical knowledge is made up of what we receive through impressions and of what our own faculty of knowledge, sensible impressions serving merely as the occasion, supplies from itself. If our faculty of knowledge makes any such addition, it may be that we are not in a position to distinguish it from the raw material until, with long practice of attention, we have become skilled in separating it. This is gonna be Kant's revolution, and what he's gonna do is all of the problems that Hume was bringing up about not being able to believe in a real world apart from the shadows because the perceptions are real, but even I, as a thing perceiving them, I don't know that I'm there except for the moments where I'm perceiving them. All of those, Hume's idea that you don't know anything unless it's through experience, and through experience, you've never known that the future will be like the past or that things affect each other in a causal nexus. You don't know any of this through experience. So therefore, you don't know anything because the only way to know things is through experience. This is a real crisis, right? And on the other side on the rationalist side, you had Mellenbranche saying, well, we can't make sense of anything that's happening. So it must be miracles all the time. So there's this real crisis moment in philosophy. And what Kant does, he emerges as this next consummate thinker. He emerges in that crisis, as they always do. And what he does in this case is he subsumes all of those problems through a psychological analysis. He's saying, wait a minute, our faculty of knowledge, he's calling it a faculty of knowledge. He's not saying we don't have knowledge, but there's a faculty, there's a thing that our brain is doing that's making it possible for us to have knowledge apart from just the things that are coming into us from objects outside. In fact, it's doing something to make those objects representable to us as the objects that we see. So the world that's presented to me in my mind is partly coming from real things that are outside myself, but partly that presentation, a presentable world to myself, is constructed by the working of a faculty designed to allow me to make sense of things. And then he says, it's so intimately linked with the objects themselves that we think that it's actually a property of the objects. But we have to be very skilled in figuring out what it is that our mind is doing to make the objects look and feel the way they look and feel because they're real. But what I mean by them is the thing that I know, which is the thing that's been presented to me. And that's real. It's partly based in something external to myself and it's partly based in something that I'm doing. And if we can figure that out, then we can sort of deal with this crisis. Okay. This then is a question which at least calls for closer examination and does not allow of any offhand answer, whether there is any knowledge that is thus independent of experience and even of all impressions of the senses. Such knowledge is entitled a priori, and distinguished from the empirical, which has its sources a posteriori, that is, in experience. So he starts out with, of course, nobody can doubt all our knowledge comes from experience. But he says, but does it really arise from experience? And he says, for instance, even the things we're experiencing, our mind is doing something to make them experienceable in the first place. So now it's still an open question. Maybe that faculty of knowledge could just do things without actually sensing stuff first, and you could have a priori knowledge. He says, still open as a possibility. Okay. The expression a priori does not, however, indicate with sufficient precision the full meaning of our question, for it has been customary to say, even of much knowledge that is derived from empirical sources, that we have it or are capable of having it a priori, meaning thereby that we do not derive it immediately from experience, but from a universal rule, a rule which is itself, however, borrowed from us by us from experience. Thus, we would say of a man who undermined the foundations of his house that he might have known ahead of time. He might have known a priori that it would fall. That is, that he need not have waited for the experience of its actually falling. But still, he could not know this completely a priori, for he had first to learn through experience that bodies are heavy and therefore fall when their supports are withdrawn. So that's not what he's talking about when he means a priori. In what follows, therefore, we shall understand by a priori knowledge, not knowledge independent of this or that experience, but knowledge absolutely independent of all experience. Opposed to it is empirical knowledge, which is knowledge possible only a posteriori, that is, through experience. A priori modes of knowledge are entitled pure when there is no admixture of anything empirical. Thus, for instance, the proposition every alteration has its cause, while an a priori proposition is not a pure proposition because alteration is a concept which can be derived only from experience. Okay, we have three categories. False a priori, which means you think it's a priori because you're saying you could have known ahead of time, but really the reason why you could have known ahead of time is because of other experiences. So that's not really a priori. But then there's two categories. There's a priori, which means absolutely independent of experience. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. So he's just using two different terms for this. Okay. So the actual a priori or the pure a priori knowledge is the knowledge that's absolutely independent of experience. Oh, yeah, no, I'm sorry. There are three categories. Okay. So excuse me again. A priori means completely independent of experience, I can come to knowledge. But then pure a priori means completely independent of experience, I can come to knowledge that also isn't even about experience. So we've got three categories. False a priori, let's just dismiss that. A priori means no experience necessary, I can come to know something. And then pure a priori means the thing I'm coming to know is not even related to things about experience. Okay. That's his definitions. We'll work with them and see where he goes. Part two, we are in possession of certain modes of a priori knowledge, and even the common understanding is never without them. Okay, that's two claims. He's going to prove them. One, we do have a priori knowledge, and two, this is certainly an addition here from Kant. Two, even all of our common understanding has some a priori element to it, something prior to experience in our constitution is an element of all the rest of our knowledge as well. So let's see what he means. What we here require is a criterion by which to distinguish with certainty between pure and empirical knowledge. Experience teaches us that a thing is so and so, but not that it cannot be otherwise. First, then, if we have a proposition which in being thought is thought as necessary, it is an a priori judgment. Okay, so we that was in our list of things to look at earlier. So necessary statements. All right. So he's saying if something is a necessary statement, that would have to be an a priori judgment. So we can think of examples, right? Um, Something cannot be A and not A in the same way at the same time, or something like uh, not both P and not P, which mean where P stands for a proposition or something like that. Or maybe even he's talking about two straight lines that intersect will never intersect more than at one point. Maybe something like that. If it's necessarily the case, it would count as a priori. So let's see if those would count in that category. Okay. And if besides it is not derived from any proposition except one, which also has the validity of a necessary judgment, it is an absolutely a priori judgment. So not only the things that necessarily are true, but all of the things implied, necessarily implied by what's necessarily true, are also a priori judgments. Secondly, experience never confers on its judgments true or strict, but only assumed and comparative universality through induction. We can properly only say, therefore, that so far as we have hitherto observed, there is no exception to this or that rule. If then a judgment is thought with strict universality, that is, in such manner that no exception is allowed as possible, it is not derived from experience, but is validly absolutely a priori. Okay, he's looking at the quality of experiential knowledge and saying, well, if it doesn't have that quality, it must be a priori. And his second example is universality. There is nothing through science and through experience that we know to be universally true. Nothing. Things fall down, matter attracts itself, things like that. Yeah, every time we've ever experienced it, it does. It's really a solid law. It's a principle. It's a law of gravity. Sure. How do you know that that's not true of a bubble of the universe where we are, and that there aren't a few bubbles in between galaxies where the opposite is the case or where that ceases to be true? We don't know. How do you know that things fall down on Jupiter? Probably they do, or at least they have a tendency to, right? But you don't really know. And if you go and you run all the experiments, you still don't know if they do on Saturn, and you don't know if they do in intergalactic space, right? So we have strong reason to think they do. But if it's a universal, it isn't come to through experience, because experience can only tell us at most every time we've ever tried and tested it, it's worked out this way. So far, that's all we can know. We can in in we can use induction to say I think it's always true, or I don't think you're going to easily find an exception, or something like that. But if we find a statement that we know to be universally true, he says, well, then it must be a priori that we know it. Okay. Empirical universality is only an arbitrary extension of a validity holding in most cases to one which holds in all. For instance, in the proposition all bodies are heavy. Okay, he's going to give the example. When, on the other hand, strict universality is essential to a judgment, if you have to, if the judgment that you're making requires universality and you think it's true, it must be known a priori if you think you know it. Okay, so let's read that again. When, on the other hand, strict universality is essential to a judgment, the judgment itself contains universality in it. This indicates a special source of knowledge, namely a faculty of a priori knowledge. Necessity was the first one, and strict universality are thus sure criteria of a priori knowledge and all inseparable from one another. But since, in the employment of these criteria, the contingency of judgments is sometimes more easily shown than their empirical limitation, or, as sometimes also happens, their unlimited universality can be more convincingly proved than their necessity, it is advisable to use the two criteria separately, each by itself being infallible. Okay, fine. Now, it is easy to show that there actually are, in human knowledge judgments which are necessary and, in the strictest sense, universal, and which are therefore pure a priori judgments. If an example of the sciences be desired, we have only to look to any of the propositions of mathematics. If we seek an example from the understanding in its quite ordinary employment, the proposition Every alteration must have a cause will serve our purpose. In the latter case, indeed, the very concept of a cause so manifestly contains the concept of a necessity of connection with an effect and of the strict universality of the rule, that the concept would be altogether lost if we attempted to derive it, as Hume has done, from a repeated association of that which happens with that which precedes, and from a custom of connecting representations, a custom originating in this repeated association and constituting, therefore, a merely subjective necessity. Even without appealing to such examples, it is possible to show that pure a priori principles are indispensable for the possibility of experience, and so to prove their existence a priori. For whence could experience derive its certainty? Okay, so before we move on to the second point of his that's still in the same paragraph, remember he's just saying, look, this thing that Hume pointed out, that you can't know that the future will be like the past, that you can't know that causes and effects are even real, that you can't know that it's just arbitrary and happenstance that the sun has come up every morning, and you actually don't have through experience any reason to believe that the sun will come up tomorrow. You believe it, but you don't know it. And furthermore, you've never experienced anything that would even tell you why it should. You just know that it keeps happening. And so you assume it's going to keep happening. He says, yeah, that's the nature of a posteriori knowledge. But then Kant is saying, yeah, but Hume, you do know certain things. You do know that there are causes and effects. You deny knowing it. You deny that you know that you even exist as an entity or as an identity. You're denying all sorts of things. But we do have the knowledge of those things. We just don't have them through experience, which was your commitment. Okay. So let's see how we have that knowledge. Even without appealing to such examples, it is possible to show that pure a priori principles are indispensable for the possibility of experience, and so to prove their existence a priori. A priori. For whence could experience derive its certainty, if all the rules according to which it proceeds were always themselves empirical and therefore contingent? They could change, right? Dependent on something else. Such rules could hardly be regarded as first principles. At present, however, we may be content to have established the fact that our faculty of knowledge does have a priori employment, and to have shown, and to have shown what are the criteria of such an employment. So he says, look, Hume is right. We don't have any reason to believe we could even know anything. Since everything comes through the senses, it's all varying and contingent and based on other things. We don't get the laws of causality. We don't get the idea that the future will be like the past from any of our experiences. That's all correct. But I've already shown Hume that we do have a priori knowledge. Okay. We should just be content right there and say, your whole crisis that the only way we could know things is through experience, and look, we can't know anything, is blown apart if we could know something another way, which we've already shown. We've already shown it from this one universal that he says every alteration must have a cause. Okay. Yes, hopefully he'll give other examples because you can imagine arguing about that one. But if you try to argue with it, Kant is going to try to illustrate that what that means is that you actually can't think anymore. Like the thinking falls apart because it's necessary that you believe that things exist within a causal nexus, which we talked about in another class, I believe. But essentially, what he's saying is not that I know what the cause of everything is or that everything has an identifiable cause. Rather, um, if the stone is hot and the sun is hot, I could think that the stone is heated up by the sun. I can think that the sun is hot because the stone made it hot. Or I can think that both of them are caused to be hot by something else. Or, what I can't do is think about any two phenomena not existing in a causal nexus of some sort, right? Like things are the way they are for reasons, and I can't think about it otherwise. It's just everything falls into absurdity after that, and there's no world to think about anymore. So, how did we come to know that? He goes, "Well, we just start with that." Well, he'll say more than that. So let's go see what he says. Such a priori origin is manifest in certain concepts, no less than in judgments. If we remove our empirical concept of a body one by one, every feature in it, which is merely empirical, the color, the hardness, or softness, the weight, you can see how this is all post Descartes, right? The weight, even the impenetrability there still remains the space which the body, now entirely vanished, occupied, and this cannot be removed. Again, if we remove from our empirical concept of any object, corporeal or incorporeal, all properties which experience has taught us, we yet cannot take away that property through which the object is thought as substance or as inhering in a substance. Although this concept of substance is more determinate than that of an object in general. Owing, therefore, to the necessity with which this concept of substance forces itself upon us, we have no opinion or we have no option save to admit that it has its seat in our faculty of a priori knowledge. Okay, let's pause. He's given two new examples now already. So the first example was everything like the causal nexus. You bring that to reality, it's inescapable, it's universal. Every thought that you have, it has that quality to it. It's a part of how the world is presentable to you. You can't be without it. Also, temporality, also spatiality, also let's see, property of oh, substance, the notion of things. Now, Hume had brought up these ideas, right? And remember, in his argument, he says in the second half, he goes, I can't even make sense of what I just said, right? I've looked back at my argument, and it doesn't even work. But his arguments were, I don't know that there is a thing here. All I know is the stuff the thing is doing, but the thing itself, that's just an illusion. I deny that it exists because I have no direct experience of it, because all my experiences are of things the thing is doing. Right. So he says, okay, I deny objects. I deny identity. I deny my own identity. All I know is that I go to sleep. I don't know that I exist. But whenever I'm having an experience of something, so the shadows are all there are. The perceptions, a series of ever changing and varied perceptions is all that there is. And I can't affirm anything else. Kant is almost swallowing the whole thing. He's just like, yeah, okay, of course, because you made this commitment that the only way you can know things is through your senses, but that's the quality of knowing things through your senses, because your senses are getting impressions put upon them by things that are outside yourself. And then that's being processed and added to it spatiality and substantialness and causal nexus. And he's going to find, I think, 16 things that are basically the word he uses is products of the faculty of knowledge. Okay. We are the sorts of things that can know things, and we can know things that are universal. And if they're universal, Hume, they didn't come to us through the senses. That doesn't mean they're not true. It's just you said the only things that could be knowledge are things that come through the senses. And then what did you do? You got rid of all the things about the things that make them thinkable in the first place. And you even said that yourself. You say, "I can't even make sense out of what my own argument is here." Okay, fine. So there's an error. You made an error, Hume, and Kant thinks he can point out what that error is, and the error is not recognizing that there are truths and a faculty of knowledge with, let's say, we won't even say it's an innate structure because it could come through experience, but a part of what makes the knowledge of the world possible is the fact that we are in the world too, and we bring something to the experiences. We're half of the story of the experience, right? The the thing makes an impression upon me. And so what you might think of is like imagine your mind as a pond, and then experiences are pebbles being thrown into the pond. Well, the experience of the pebble is the ripple. And part of that is absolutely you can determine about something external to yourself and the quality and the speed and the momentum at which it hit and the location it hit, right? You can know things about the thing out there that is making this impression upon you. But also, the ripples are a product of the fact that you are the type of thing that you are. So, when through the senses, ripples are sent through your brain by the things you're experiencing, part of the quality of the thing you're experiencing, and he's trying to separate out, right, the difference between the rock and the ripples, but both of them together are the experience of the rock, right? The if you just throw the rock and there's no pond there, then the rock just keeps following a parabolic path and it doesn't have that analogous experience. But the experience is okay, things are making an impression upon me. upon me. And I am the sort of structure that understands those impressions through a lens. Maybe 16 lenses, lenses of spatiality, lenses of temporality, lenses of substantialness, right? So, Hume, you couldn't figure out where the substance was in the thing. The substance is that's what a thing like this looks like to you because you understand substantiality. And so the way it makes itself felt on you, right? If you were a neutrino, you just pass right through this thing. It's not substantial, right? You'd pass through the entire earth without striking anything, right? So it's the way that you are constructed that allows you to experience the world the way you experience it. Now, that's not an anti-realist position unless you deny that there are things. But Kant is saying no, part of the experience is the impression made upon me by the thing. That's part of it. The other part of the way it has the quality that it has, and the fact that I can make it thinkable, and it's a thing that I can converse about and analyze and meditate upon, is the way I respond to the impression that it's making on me. Okay, that's I find Kant very difficult to read, so I'm gonna ramble a little bit until I think I've sort of circled it around and kinda got closer to what, uh, would be more accurate to say about it. So, all right, part 3. So forgive me for that. So philosophy stands in need of a science which shall determine the possibility, the principles, and the extent of all a priori knowledge. So now he's saying we need a new subject in philosophy to figure out what these things are, right? I've pointed out we have a priori knowledge. I've pointed out that there are universals, like you can't not think of the spatiality of stuff. I mean, you can take away all the qualities of this thing, the space it used to be in is still something that you've always got in your head. And you can't get rid of that. That's a universal because that's a part of the experience that you allowed to be experienced by you by partially helping to construct whatever input this gave to you into a presentable form that you could consider. Something like that. Okay. But what is still more extraordinary than all the preceding is this, that certain modes of knowledge leave the field of all possible experiences and have the appearance of extending the scope of our judgments beyond all limits of experience, and this by means of concepts to which no corresponding object can ever be given in experience. So he's going to say there's a priori that's even purer than this. Okay. It is precisely by means of the latter modes of knowledge in a realm beyond the world of the senses where experience can yield neither guidance nor correction that our reason carries on those inquiries which owing to their importance we consider to be far more excellent and in their purpose far more lofty than all the understanding can learn in the field of appearances. Indeed, we prefer to run every risk of error rather than desist from such urgent inquiries on the ground of their dubious character or from disdain and indifference. These unavoidable problems set by pure reason itself are God, freedom, and immortality. The science which, with all its preparations, is in its final intention directed solely to their solution is metaphysics, and its procedure is at first dogmatic, that is, it confidently sets itself to this task without any previous examination of the capacity or incapacity of reason for so great an undertaking. Now, it does indeed seem natural that, as soon as we have left the ground of experience, we should, through careful inquiries, assure ourselves as to the foundations of any building that we propose to erect, not making use of any knowledge that we possess without first determining whence it has come, and not trusting to principles without knowing their origin. It is natural, that is to say, that the question should first be considered how the understanding can arrive at all this knowledge a priori and to what extent, or I'm sorry, and what extent validity and worth it may have. Nothing, indeed, could be more natural. If by the term natural we signify what fittingly and reasonably ought to happen. But If we mean by natural what ordinarily happens, then on the contrary, nothing is more natural and more intelligible than the fact that this inquiry has been so long neglected. For one part of this knowledge, the mathematical, has long been of established reliability, and so gives rise to a favorable presumption as regards the other part, which may yet be of quite different nature. Besides, once we are outside the circle of experience, we can be sure to not we can be sure of not being contradicted by experience. The charm of extending our knowledge is so great that nothing short of encountering a direct contradiction can suffice to arrest us in our course, and this can be avoided if we are careful in our fabrications, which nonetheless will still remain fabrications. Mathematics gives us a shining example of how far, independently of experience, we can progress in a priori knowledge. It does, indeed, occupy itself with objects and with knowledge solely insofar as they allow of being exhibited in intuition. But this circumstance is easily overlooked, since this intuition can itself be given a priori and is therefore hardly to be distinguished from a bare and pure concept. Misled by such a proof of the powers of reason. Okay, sorry, we're going to pause for a moment. So much of what we read with Plato and his example of the slave boy knowing geometry and all of that stuff, so much of what Socrates was concerned with is what he's concerned with here. And let's just really quickly rehash and say what he's saying is mathematics is pure reason. It's pure a priori knowledge. We will draw a triangle, but it's not a triangle. It's an approximation of a triangle. We'll count blocks, but the concept of the number is an abstract thing. It doesn't rely on there being blocks. Okay. It's pure like that. But then there's this other field of metaphysics, and we've been doing metaphysics, but he says, it's by definition apart from all experience. So we can't ever run an experiment to tell us we got it right or we got it wrong. That's not the nature of what we're talking about in metaphysics, right? If somebody says, "Well, show me the experiment of godness," and like point where he is and show like it's not that kind of thing. And then he says what we ought to do right now before we do anything else in metaphysics is stop and make a new science of trying to figure out how it is possible that we could know anything in that realm. We seem to, right? He's not denying that that's a real discipline, but he's saying we haven't grounded it in anything. We should invent a new science of, we're going to read the prolegomena, but we should invent a new science of setting the stage for understanding the nature of how we can come to know those things because we'll make a lot more progress. Because right now, all we're doing is relying on the rules of right reason. Okay. So we're coming up with notions and then we're saying, do those notions contradict themselves? If they do, we're dismissing it and somebody else has a warring notion. And so we're philosophizing in this realm and that's fine. But we really need to understand how we can navigate in that realm at all so that, that would help us out. We'd learn a lot more. We'd come to a lot more knowledge. We'd know the quality and the extent of that knowledge, but we've not done this before. So he's calling for a halt to metaphysics until we invent this new science that would allow us to understand how it's possible that we could come to know anything metaphysical. The mathematical, it's all just based in the reason. And so it just sort of works for him. But okay. So, but all right. So to remind us of how Socrates is talking about all these same things, Socrates says, all of this experiential stuff, everything you can learn through physics and chemistry, I gave up on those subjects. I even gave up on mathematics. I'm only concerned with this metaphysical. I'm only concerned with the arche. I only want to get to know the source of all truth being goodness, justice, and love, and to relate to it properly. There's this thing, and I can't speak about it properly. I can't give you the right definition. If you think you know it, I'm going to ask you for a definition. I'm going to show you it contradicts itself. All the philosophy is insufficient for that, okay? But he's talking about the same thing, right? But he feels like he has a license to proceed using philosophy, using good conversation, using something characterological and relational, because it's relational, the type of knowledge he wants. He thinks he can go forward that way. Kant is saying, well, wait a minute, hold on a second. Sure, that sounds great, and it's probably all true. Before we do that, Socrates, we should set up a new science in between the mathematics and this thing that you're trying to get at that you won't get at until after you're dead, you say, right? We should have a science of how to navigate that properly, and it's more than just the arguments that we use to show that something contradicted, so therefore it can't be true or has an absurd implication or something like that. What we should do instead is actually figure out what it is our brain is doing, just like it imparts spatiality and temporality and a causal nexus and a bunch of other things. Every time we're having any sensory experience, the a priori, that is the foundation for that kind of knowledge, that's working all the time. We need to study that. We need to understand how it works, the quality of how it works, to what extent it's reliable and all of that. Then let's go and restart metaphysics again. Metaphysics needs to be newly grounded. Okay, that's enough. Um, uh, let's start back here. All right. Mathematics gives us a shining example of how far independently of experience we can progress in a priori knowledge. It does indeed occupy itself with objects and with knowledge solely insofar as they allow of being exhibited in intuition. That's the more abstract, right? There's a footnote here. Kant means that geometrical concepts can be represented by diagrams. Yeah, we know what he means. Okay. But this circumstance is easily overlooked since this intuition can itself be given a priori and is therefore hardly to be distinguished from a bare and pure concept. Misled. Okay, so remember, Socrates is showing that the slave boy knows truths about the proportions of different squares, but he doesn't know that he knows them, but he can be led to reveal that he knows them. Kant is saying, no, 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 you know them because you're bringing something to the thinking to begin with. And that's really sort of what that knowledge is rooted in. That's what Socrates says, right? You know it because you experienced it. Remember, Socrates is talking away from science, and yet he still says you must have experienced it. But it's an experience after you're dead, right? You've been one with the grand oneness, and so you know all of the numbers. You know sameness as a concept, even though none of your experiences ever taught you sameness. You've never experienced it in your post-birth life, right? So he's saying you know it through experience, and then you're born and you have to recollect what you know, but you're using it all the time, right? Kant is pointing out that you're using it all the time. And that's exactly what Socrates was saying when he said, show me of these statues which are more similar. Say, how do you do that? Well, because I know what sameness is. Oh, good. When did you experience sameness? When did you experience pure actual sameness? Because there are a billion differences between every 2 statues that you pick up to tell me that these 2 are more the same than any others. So how do you know what sameness really is? And he's saying, well, you must have experienced it, right? So he does believe that the knowledge has to be based in something experiential, but his story is that it's after you die and then before you're reborn again that you're reunited with the forms. I will just say for Plato, the forms. Kant is saying, okay, I don't know how we know this exactly. Maybe we should set up a science to figure out how this whole thing works. Because Socrates was right. You can know things, and you're even knowing it through your regular experience. There's an element of a priori in all of it. But we need to study that because metaphysics is all a priori. And all we have right now are the rules of right reason to guide that conversation, which of course is lovely. But he wants to set up a new science for understanding the way the a priori works. He thinks we'll make advances in metaphysics if we do. Okay, let's move on. But this circumstance is easily overlooked since this intuition can itself be given a priori. So you think of it as a basic concept. It's not a basic concept, it's that you knew it already. Same as the recollection idea. All right, inequality. Okay, misled by such a proof of the powers of reason, the demand for the extension of knowledge recognizes no limits. The light dove, cleaving the air in her free flight, and feeling its resistance, might imagine that its flight would be still easier in empty space. It was thus that Plato left the world of the senses as setting too narrow limits on the understanding and ventured out beyond it on the wings of the ideas, on the empty space of the pure understanding. He did not observe that with all his efforts, he made no advance, meeting no resistance that might, as it were, serve as a support upon which he could take a stand, to which he could apply his powers and so set his understanding in motion. It is, indeed, the common fate of human reason to complete its speculative structures as speedily as may be, and only afterwards to inquire whether the foundations are reliable. All sorts of excuses will then be applied to appealed to in order to reassure us of their solidity, or rather, indeed, to enable us to dispense altogether with so late and so dangerous an inquiry. But what keeps us during the actual building free from all apprehension and suspicion and flatters us with a seeming thoroughness is this other circumstance, namely, that a great, perhaps the greatest, part of the business of our reason consists in analysis of the concepts which we already have of objects. This analysis supplies us with a considerable body of knowledge, which, while nothing but explanation or elucidation of what has already been thought in our concepts, though in a confused manner, is yet prized as being, at least as regards its form, new insight. But so far as the matter or content is concerned, there has been no extension of our previously possessed concepts, but only an analysis of them. Since this procedure yields real knowledge a priori, which progresses in an assured and useful fashion, reason is so far misled as surreptitiously to introduce, without itself being aware of so doing, assertions of an entirely different order in which it attaches to given concepts others completely foreign to them, and moreover attaches them a priori. And yet it is not known how reason can be in a position to do this. Such a question is never so much as thought of. I shall therefore at once proceed to deal with the difference between these two kinds of knowledge. All right, let's pause. So, Plato was too hasty. Things need to be grounded. We need a foundation for all of this. What if the stuff our mind is doing to make the world presentable is all false? What if it's in error? How do we know we can trust it? You didn't even ask those questions. And he says the reason why is that you've been using those for all your experience as well. You're just so used to relying on the a priori that you never even realize that you should be asking the question, hey, wait a minute, hold on a second. How do I know that that's reliable? All right. So there's still a crisis to deal with here, but he's showing the direction he wants to go in for resolving this Humean problem, right? He wants to examine the nature of the a priori, figure out why it's reliable, to what extent, why it's necessary, why it's universal, what's going on here. He wants to start with that before he'll allow Socrates to get on with his conversations, right? Socrates got to the exact same place as Hume. I'm sorry, as beyond Hume. He got to the exact same place as Kant here in the sense that he said, oh, yeah, physics, chemistry, geology, all of that's useful, all of it's wonderful. None of it is going to give me the ultimate reality of anything. Mathematics, pure reason, even that, he says, nope, not good enough. And I know why, because all of the science stuff is based on my perceptions, and those are all ever changing. And how do I know they'll be the same? And all of that sort of thing. It's like, that's not ultimate reality. Kant is like, yeah, okay, you're bringing something to it. Socrates says, yeah, you're bringing something to it. I've been trying to illustrate that to people, right? You're bringing notions of sameness and equality and weightiness you can measure things on a scale, but the concepts of greater and lesser, those are things you're bringing to it. And none of what you've experienced makes any sense without those concepts, and you've been applying them to the things without realizing it. Socrates will point it out in conversation. Kant is pointing it out here. So they're both following the trail that much. And then for some reason, Kant says, sit down by the trail with me a while, Socrates. We need to have we need to have more knowledge about how this a priori works before we can continue using it to explore metaphysical questions. And he says, but Plato, he's just so used to using it, and he knows that we're all using it all the time, that he sees no problem in flying into that realm of ideas and going there, right? So Kant's criticism is You're like a bird that thinks it would be easier to fly in space than with the air, not realizing that if you had some resistance, that's how you're actually flying. But you're just gonna fly into the world of ideas and leave everything else behind, and it's not really gonna work. But some people think it did work, right? There are Neoplatonists. There are people who say, well, Plato got it figured out. He did it right, and Socrates too, and all of that. So we don't have to pick sides on this. All we're saying is, from Kant's perspective, the appropriate thing to do would be to stop right here and say, okay, now that I know that I'm bringing notions to my experience, making my experience possible by applying them in unison with the actual impressions that are made upon me. Now that I know that I have access to those things, so that when I'm doing geometry, as Socrates also pointed out, right? When you read all those arguments from Socrates, it's like, wait, what are you talking about? Okay. Do you understand Kant? That's what he's talking about, right? So what did he do? He said, well, Kant says, well, you think you're discovering truths about geometry, but really these are you bringing this knowledge here. Socrates says the same thing. That's why Plato has this idea of recollection and reincarnation and all of that. So they're seeing that same truth, both of them. The difference is Kant says, okay, if that's the situation we're in, we should stop and build a foundation for the rest of metaphysics. We need a new foundation, a groundwork. We need to sit here and we need to start asking some questions about what this a priori thing is. Since we're using it all the time, some people thought there's no such thing as a priori. Hume denied it, and he was left in a world he couldn't even make sense of, even in arguments saying it doesn't make sense. Right? Kant said, well, okay, we're using it all the time. We use it to have experiences, to have a world that we can present to ourselves. We're bringing some half part of what makes the world appearable to me and presentable to me is something I'm bringing to it. I'm infusing the thing with objectness or substantialness or temporality or spatiality and all of that. That's not something that the thing is beaming at me. It's color it is maybe, right? It's impenetrability perhaps. I can sense that my finger won't go through it. Those things are coming to me through my senses. It's there, but also, if I took away all the things coming to me through the senses, I can't get rid of the idea of there being some space there that it used to be. Wait, that's not coming at me from the thing. That's here. That's being added to these other things so that it's a thing I can imagine picking up, and then it all works, right? So maybe it's reliable, but we need to sit here and we need to figure out how it could be reliable. Imagine what kind of metaphysics we'd be able to do then. Perhaps something that would be the ultimate answers that wouldn't be overturned and wouldn't be something that could collapse again. Okay, so we understand his idea. We're going to stop there halfway through because Kant is what he is, and he's fantastic. But we're going to stop there, and he's going to continue. He's going to continue with this project. And he's taking us step by step, and so far, it's pretty clear what he's doing and where he's going, and that's all fine. So we're going to cut it short. Sometimes we go 2 hours, but Kant, we're gonna read the other half next time, I think. So I don't remember what comes next. There's not a reason to postpone it. It's just I want to cut it in half. So we're going to end the stream. Please unmute and speak up if you've got some things you want to say before we go into our after conversation before we stop the recording.
I'm trying to determine how I want to start this. It was interesting. He touches on how there. What he said. There's something. It's like you have experience before you've experienced it without having an experience.
Yeah. He's saying your experiences are partly made up of the things that are impressing themselves upon you, but partly they're made up of something that's already in you to apply to those impulses, a thing that makes them representable to you as something that you just think is all from outside, right? Because they're so intimately linked, because the box appears as taking up space and being a spatial object and all of that, you just assume that that's coming to you through the senses too, because it's all just in the object. But some of what comes to you about the object is coming to you from the object, and some of it is the way you organize and process what's coming at you from the object into the thing with the spatiality isn't being sent at you through a sensory organ that detects the spatiality of it. Instead, the spatiality as a concept is being applied to the thing because that's the way your brain organizes and assists the data input to present to you the object, which by the way does take up this space, right? It doesn't make it false that you're helping to it, it's not necessarily, we don't know how much we can rely on it, but it's not necessarily false just because our minds are helping to present the data in a way that makes it presentable to us. So our experience is partly reliant on the things that are impressing themselves on us, and it's partly reliant on us being the sorts of things that can process experiences.
Okay, so that leads to where you were saying that Socrates, he was going a step above Socrates in saying, let me make sure I can get this right. In saying that there's something, there's more than just this assumption that you have. Let's see if I can do a better job of.
So Socrates, this is I yeah, let's talk this out till we get it clear. This is a good question. Let's work it out. So Socrates doesn't think it's just an assumption, right? Socrates thinks you have knowledge of things that you couldn't possibly have had knowledge just through your experience. So you've gotten them by, let's call it the fingerprint of the divine, or through your communion and experience directly with the divine forms before you were born or something like that, and then you recollect it, and he does it with geometry, which is that's a priori, but also he thinks that it is a part of your ability to make judgments about your experiences as well. He's on the same page, so they've walked the same distance. I'm not sure Kant goes further than Socrates. What he says is Plato starts going further than I think we should go. What he should do is stop right here with me and see, can we examine what this a priori is so we know how it works, how reliable it is, why it's reliable if it is, and then we can start the metaphysics again. And then maybe we'll get somewhere more sure than we've gotten so far just using process of elimination by finding illogical things about certain constructions and dismissing them, and then trying to come up with better ones, which
Okay,
is what
so
he
it
thinks.
was all right. So it was that. Okay, it was the piece that he was saying. Look, Socrates says that he's not going to discover this until he dies and before he's reborn and reconnects with the forms. However you want to explain that. He was saying, well, before we even get there, we should have a science in place and a better understanding of what this a priori is, instead of just going all the way to the end of saying, look, I'm gonna find out then. So why worry about it now?
Okay, so Socrates, when he, or let's say Plato, let's go with Plato right now. When Plato has this idea of recollection, that's a metaphysical claim, right? And Kant is saying this is at the root of metaphysics, right? A priori is part of all your experience. It's also basically all of mathematics. Just like Socrates said, you think you're discovering truths, but really they're in you. You're discovering things that are already written into you through your examination of the implications of ideas of triangles and squares and all of that. So they both agree that's purely a priori. Now, Socrates says, I can explain that. Let me give you a story. It's like a metaphor, but it's a metaphysical story. It's an argument about how that could be possible. And then he presents an argument. And in fact, in one of the times that he talks, that Plato has him talking in this metaphorical way, he says, this is a metaphor. This is a story that's, I can't tell you how I know this, is what he actually says. He says, I can't tell you how I know this. There's not enough time. Maybe it's a prophetic revelation, something like that. I can't justify it philosophically. But the gist is something like this. And then he gives a metaphysical explanation for exactly the same thing that Kant has narrowed in on, right? Kant and Socrates are talking about the exact same thing. Say, wait a minute, you're bringing something to this. Your experiences, you would be like Hume, living in a world of ever changing experiences, of ever changing contingent things. How do you have a notion? And Descartes said the same thing. How do you have a notion of something infinite? You've never experienced that. You know you're not that. You've been fooled by things. You're not like that. And yet you have the imprint of that on you. Where did that come from? Right? So they're all three of these guys are identifying the exact same thing. And then Kant says, "Hold on, guys. Hold on." Specifically to Plato. He says, "Hold on. Before you tell us the metaphysics has to, just like geometry, be based in this a priori. It's not based in experience. It is based. Look, I agree. We can get a priori knowledge. We have it in everything. Even it's a part of our experience too, but also pure mathematics. Great. A priori knowledge is possible. I affirm it. We could totally have it. But now you're going into the metaphysical realm. That has to be based in this a priori. And you're going there and you're telling us stories and you're arguing with each other and you're using rules of reason to try to get rid of bad ideas that are not as good. But that's no way to move forward. What we need to do first is stop right here and figure out this whole a priori faculty of knowledge that we have. And then let's go do metaphysics. First, we have to ground it in something. And you think you can just fly into it, Plato. You think you can just go, hey, let me tell you, it's got to be true. It's got to be real. Look, you didn't get any of this from your experience. Everything in the temporal limited world is not like this. And yet you are bringing notions of things like that to even be able to experience reality. They both have the exact same insight. But then Kant is saying, okay, let's do metaphysics. Let's do a great metaphysics. How are we going to do that? By not doing metaphysics. In one of his writings, he says, I call for a halt on all metaphysics until we figure this out. And then he spends his time trying to figure it out. And that's, we'll read more later. But he says, let's just pause all metaphysics. Let's stop talking about reincarnation and God's nature and other worlds and the forms. Let's stop. You might be right about all that. I don't know. But I know that we'll be able to figure out what's right about that if we have some sort of principles that could push back against us, right? We can do science because the experiments could tell us we were wrong, and that's how we can move forward. We need a method like that, and we can't do that until we understand exactly how this a priori faculty of knowledge is working within us, how it's reliable, in what ways it's reliable, what it's doing. We don't know the answers to any of those things. Let's figure that out first, then let's go do metaphysics, and who knows what we'll figure out. Maybe Plato was right all along, but we need to ground it first. So I think I'm speaking correctly. I think that answers. Is that on topic?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. That's exactly what I got. What I wanted to
Okay, good. Then
go
we
over.
lucked out because Kant always gives me a dizzying headache. So, alrighty, good. I'm glad that we're talking. All right, so we're gonna finish the rest of that next time. And that was pretty good. That was a good first half, and the next half, who knows how much she's gonna get to, and it's gonna be great, I'm sure. But we're gonna put a pause on it here. We'll end the video part of all of this, and we'll go have our re-dive into it. Awesome after conversation. So let's go do that.